All right, so in this section, we're going to talk about the causes of the American Revolution, and we're going to kind of get rolling on this pretty quick here. So, almost immediately, the American Revolution resulted directly from attempts to reform the British Empire after the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. It culminated in nearly a half century of war between Europe's imperial powers, and it truly was a world war fought between multiple empires on multiple continents. And at its conclusion, the British Empire had never been larger. Britain now controlled North American continent east of the Mississippi River, including French Canada. It also consolidated power over India. But the realities and responsibilities of the post-war empire were really daunting. War, let alone victory on such a scale, was very costly, and Britain doubled the national debt to 13 and a half times its annual revenue. Britain faced significant new costs required to secure and defend its far-flung empire, especially the western frontiers of the North American colonies. And these factors lead Britain to attempt to consolidate control over the North American colonies, which in turn leads to resistance. Now, King George III takes the crown in 1760 and brought Tories into his government after 3 decades of Whig rule. And they represented an authoritarian vision of the empire, which colonies would, be subordinate to the crown. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was Britain's first major post-war imperial action targeting North America. And you need to remember, for quiz and test purposes, that because of the Royal Proclamation, the king forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains in an attempt to limit costly wars with Native Americans. But colonists protested and demanded access to that territory because they had fought alongside the British to get it. Okay? Parliament in 1764 passes 2 more reforms, the Sugar Act, which sought to combat widespread smuggling of molasses in New England, and it did this by cutting the tax in half, but in increased enforcement. Smugglers would also be tried by the Vice Admiralty courts and not by juries of their peers, which they had grown used to. Parliament also passed the Currency Act, which restricted colonies from producing paper money. So they wanted them to use only British hard currency, such as gold and silver coins. Well, those are scarce in the colonies, and the lack of currency impeded the colonists' increasingly sophisticated transatlantic economies. But it was especially damaging in 1764 because a post-war recession had kind of begun. And so between the restrictions of the Proclamation of 1763, the Currency Act, and the Sugar Act, canceling trials by jury for smugglers, some colonists really began to fear that this pattern of increased taxation and restricted liberties was going to continue. By March of 1765, Parliament passes the Stamp Act, which required that many documents be printed on paper that had been stamped to show that the taxes had been paid on them, including newspaper, pamphlets, diplomas, legal documents, even playing cards. And so it's important to know for quiz purposes the difference between the Sugar Act of 1764, which was an attempt to get merchants to pay something like a tax that already existed, and the Stamp Act, which created a brand new direct tax. Okay, Parliament had never before directly taxed the colonists. Instead, colonies contributed to the empire through the payment of direct external taxes such as customs. In 1765, a guy named Daniel Delaney of Maryland wrote this. He said, "A right to impose an internal tax on the colony without their consent for the single purpose of revenue is denied. A right to regulate their trade without their consent is admitted. Also, unlike the Sugar Act, which primarily focused and affected merchants, the Stamp Act directly affected numerous groups throughout the colonies, including printers, lawyers, graduate colleges, even sailors who played cards. So this led in part to a more broad and popular resistance. Now, the resistance to the Stamp Act took 3 forms, and they distinguished largely by class: legislative resistance by elites, economic resistance by merchants, and popular protest by common colonists. So colonial elites responded by passing resolutions in their assemblies. The most famous of the anti-Stamp Act resolutions were the Virginia Resolves, passed by the House of Burgesses on May 30th of 1765, and it declared that the colonists were entitled to all the liberties, privileges, franchises, and immunities possessed by the people of Great Britain. When the Virginia Resolves were printed throughout the colonies, however, they often included extra, far more radical resolutions that the Virginia House of Burgesses didn't actually pass. And one of those asserted that only the General Assembly of the colony have any right or power to impose any taxation, and that anyone who argued differently shall be deemed an enemy to His Majesty's colony. So that was not actually in there, but it was printed as though it was. These additional items spread throughout the colonies and helped radicalize subsequent responses in other colonial assemblies. These responses eventually led to the calling of the Stamp Act Congress in New York in October of 1765. 9 colonies sent delegates, including Ben Franklin, John Dickinson, Thomas Hutchinson, Philip Livingston, James Otis. And the Stamp Act Congress issues something called a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which, like the Virginia Resolves, declared allegiance to the king and all due subordination to Parliament, but reasserted the idea that colonists were entitled to the same rights as Britons, which included trial by jury, which had already been taken away by the Sugar Act, the right to be taxed only by their own elected representatives, and again, Daniel Delaney writes again, it's an essential principle of the English Constitution that the subject shall not be taxed without his consent. Then Benjamin Franklin called it the prime maxim of all free government because the colonies did not elect members to Parliament. They believed that they were not represented and could not be taxed by that body. So in response, Parliament and the Crown argued that the colonists were virtually represented, just like the residents of those boroughs or counties in England that didn't elect members to Parliament either. However, the colonists reject that notion of virtual representation, with one pamphleteer calling it a monstrous idea. The second type of resistance to the Stamp Act was economic. While the Stamp Act Congress deliberated, merchants in major port cities were preparing non-importation agreements, hoping that their refusal to import British goods would eventually lead British merchants to actually lobby for the repeal of the Stamp Act themselves. In New York City, upward of 200 principal merchants agreed not to import, sell, or buy any goods, wares, or merchandise from Great Britain. In Philadelphia, merchants gathered at a general meeting to agree that they would not import any goods from Great Britain until the Stamp Act was repealed. The plan worked, and by January of 1766, London merchants sent a letter to Parliament arguing that they had reduced to the necessity of pending ruin their business, and that the Stamp Act should be repealed, and that the subsequent boycotts had really financially harmed them. The third and perhaps most crucial type of resistance was the popular protests, riots breaking out in Boston in particular. Crowds burned the appointed stamp distributor for Massachusetts, Andrew Oliver, in effigy, like a representation of him. They pulled a building he owned to the ground. Oliver resigned his position the next day, and then the following week, a crowd set upon the home of his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who had publicly argued for submission to the Stamp Act. Before the evening was over, much of Hutchinson's home and belongings had been destroyed. Popular violence and intimidation spread quickly throughout the colonies. In New York City, they posted notices that read, "The first man that either distributes or makes use of the stamp paper, let him take care of his house, person, and effects." Right? By November 16th, all of the original 12 stamp distributors had resigned, and by 1766, groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty were formed in most colonies to direct and organize further resistance. These tactics had the dual effect of sending messages to Parliament and discouraging colonists from accepting appointments as stamp collectors. With no one to distribute the stamps, this act basically became unenforceable. Okay, but the British still needed revenue. Okay, so pressure on Parliament eventually grows, and they repeal it. But to save face, they try and avoid this problem in the future. They pass something called the Declaratory Act, which said that Parliament had the full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. Now, for quiz purposes, it's important to remember, they didn't pay attention to that. At the end of the Stamp Act, they were too busy celebrating King George, and they celebrated King George by putting up a huge statue in his honor, right? So that's how they celebrated it. it could be it could be argued that there was no moment at which the colonists felt more proud to be members of the free British Empire than 1766. But again, the British still needed to collect revenue from them. The colonies had resisted the implementation of direct taxes, but the Declaratory Act reserved Parliament's right to impose them. And in the colonists' dispatches to Parliament and in numerous pamphlets, they had explicitly acknowledged the right of Parliament to regulate colonial trade. So Britain's next attempt to draw revenues from the colonies, the Townsend Act, were passed in June of 1767. They created new customs on common items like lead, glass, paint, tea, instead of direct taxes. The acts also created and strengthened The Townsend Act also created and strengthened formal mechanisms to enforce compliance, including a new American Board of Customs Commissioners and more Vice Admiralty courts to try smugglers. Revenues from the customs seizures would be used to pay customs officers and other royal officials, including the governors, thereby incentivizing them to convict offenders. So these acts increased the presence of the British government in the colonies and circumscribed the authority of the colonial assemblies. Since paying the governor's salary had long given the assemblies significant power over them, which now they don't have. Unsurprisingly, the colonists once again resist. Even though these were import taxes, many colonial resistance authors referred to them as, just direct taxes because they were designed primarily to extract revenues from the colonies, not to regulate trade. So John Dickinson, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, writes that we may be legally bound to pay any general duties on the commodities relative to the regulation of trade, that's granted. But we, being obliged by her laws to take them from Great Britain, any special duties imposed on their exportation to us only, with intention to raise a revenue from us only, are as much taxes upon us as those imposed by the Stamp Act. So many authors asked, once the colonies assent to a tax in any form, what would stop the British from imposing even more and greater taxes on the colonies? So new forms of resistance emerge in the elite, middle, and working class, and they all kind of participate together. Merchants reinstitute non-importation agreements. Common colonists agree not to consume these same products. Lists are circulated with, signatories promising not to buy any British goods. And these lists would be published in newspapers, bestowing recognition on those who had signed, and this led to pressure on those that hadn't. You may want to write down and take note for quiz purposes here that women also became really involved in an unprecedented degree in the resistance to the Townsend Act. They circulated subscription lists, they gathered signatures. It was really the first they wrote the first political commentaries in newspapers also. And so without new British imports, British clothes, people saw wearing the colonists began wearing homespun clothes, and, spinning clubs get formed, and where local women would gather at the home of one of the women in the community and spin clothes, and this became, really a marker of one's virtue and patriotism. And women were an important part of this cultural shift. At the same time, British goods and luxuries previously desired became symbols of tyranny. These non-importation and especially non-consumption agreements changed colonists' cultural relationship with the mother country. Committees of inspection monitored merchants and residents to make sure that no one broke the agreements, and offenders would expect to be shamed by having their names and offenses published in the newspapers. Non-importation and non-consumption helped form colonial unity. Colonies formed committees of correspondence to keep each other informed of the resistance efforts throughout the colonies, and newspapers reprinted the exploits of resistance, giving colonists a sense that they were really part of a broad political community. The best example of this new continental conversation came in the wake of the Boston Massacre, where Britain sent this regiment to Boston in 1768 to help enforce the new acts and quell resistance. On the evening of March 5th of 1770, a crowd gathers outside the custom house, and they start hurling insults and snowballs and other rocks and things like that at this young sentry. Well, a number of soldiers show up to the sentry's aid. The crowd grows increasingly hostile until some of the soldiers fire. Now, after the smoke clears, 5 Bostonians are dead, including one of the ringleaders, a guy named Crispus Attucks, who was a former slave turned free dock worker. The soldiers were tried in Boston and were actually acquitted, thanks in part to the great work by their defense attorney, a young lawyer named John Adams. Yes, the same John Adams. Now, the impact of the Boston Massacre and how quickly it spread is worth taking note of for quiz purposes. It spread quickly through these new resistance communication networks, and it was aided by a full famous engraving circulated by a guy named Paul Revere, which depicted these bloodthirsty British soldiers, grins on their faces, firing into a peaceful crowd. And the engraving was quickly circulated and reprinted throughout the colonies, which generated sympathy for Boston and anger with Britain. Resistance led to repeal once again, and in March 1770, Parliament repealed all of the new duties except the one on tea, which, like the Declaratory Act, was left in part kind of to save face and assert that Parliament still retained the right to tax the colonies. The character of colonial resistance had changed between 1765 and 1770. During the Stamp Act resistance, elites wrote resolves and held congresses, while violent popular mobs, burned effigies and tore down houses, with minimal coordination between the colonies. But methods of resistance against the Townsend Act became more inclusive and more coordinated. Colonists previously excluded from meaningful political participation now gathered signatures, and colonists of all ranks participated in these resistances by not buying British goods and monitoring and enforcing the boycotts. So Britain's failed attempt at imperial reform really created this increasingly vigilant and resistant colonial population, and most importantly, an enlarged political sphere, both on the colonial and continental levels, far beyond anything could have imagined a few years earlier. And so this new sense of shared grievances began to join the colonists in shared political identity. And that will get us to the Declaration of Independence and growing independence in the next section.